to be brief and get to the point quicker, as quickly as possible. I was down in Ivy House yesterday, a very positive event to learn about ODA, and it was good to see there was a comment in one of the opening speeches in the book that the ODI has recognised that Ireland was the most effective donor in reaching those in extreme poverty. So this is all very, very positive. Now, you were mentioning about climate change causing displacement, which we know, but there's another displacement that I don't think is on the place in the agenda where it should be, and that's the displacement that comes from multinational, transnationals, and the land grabs that are going on. Now, I came back from Ivy House yesterday because I was chairing a meeting for Troika in the AV room, and we had Abelino, a human rights defender from Guatemala, just recently released from prison after a few years for defending his community, and he was in Ireland to receive the Oscar Romero Award. And we also had Nope from Myanmar, and the common denominator was them trying to protect the land from these transnational companies, multinational companies, who can do anything that they like, carte blanche. So that brings me into one of my favourite topics, the business and human rights, our national plan and also the UN plan. And I was very taken aback to learn that Ireland is not keen on legally binding, to agreeing with a legally binding plan. Now, unless it's legally binding, these transnational, these corporations are going to be able to do what they like in countries in South America and in Africa. And we know that the EU private sector is becoming more involved in Africa, and it's seen as a way to help Africa, as you've just said there. We know there's a big push on trade with China. We don't need to mention some of the working conditions there. I was at a launch of a report recently by Church and Chains, and it was appalling to learn what is happening there. And just last week, Senator Lawless and I had a very interesting discussion with the Shura Council from Saudi Arabia about how migrants are treated in Middle Eastern countries. So all of that brings me to the point is, why is Ireland not supporting a legally binding UN treaty on business and human rights? That's my first question. Secondly, I've attended some of the CDYSP meetings that have been held, and there's no doubt there is a growing militarisation agenda in Europe. There's a part of me that can understand it for some countries, particularly the Baltic countries, particularly some in Eastern Europe, and our committee were in Georgia. So we do see the fear that is there of further aggression by Russia. But I don't believe that militarisation is the answer in any of these situations. And that brings me to continue from the exchange we had at Leaders, the European Peace Facility, because I think there are questions about that. It's fine in theory, but transparency and accountability are not obvious. And there are concerns that the European Peace Facility is not transparent and it's not accountable. Will proposals go to national parliaments? Will it come to, say, for example, the like of our committee? Is there a guarantee that peace building alternatives will be considered first? And then on the list of eligible equipment, do we know that it will exclude lethal weapons? So that's my question there. Deputy Crowe mentioned Palestine, but I just want to come from another angle, which is the national state law, which is that this country is Jewish and democratic. So how can the rights of Palestinian people be recognised if that is what the government are saying about the state? And I know you mentioned there, I know your own interest in this, I know the procedure that you're following, and you mentioned things are said in the heat of an election. But outside the heat of an election, settlements are continuing. And you've seen it, and I've seen it because I've been there. The Green Line is gone. And I think we are doing a disservice, I think we're being disrespectful to the Palestinian people to continue to talk about a two-state solution when everybody knows that that is not viable, and it's becoming less and less viable as more and more settlements are being built. And my last question then is on Syria, our humanitarian assistance. I'd just like to know, how is that dispersed? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy O'Sullivan Thomas, Chair.
Right, yeah. First of all, on I think it was very encouraging that ODI ranked Ireland as #1 in terms of our development assistance programme, in terms of getting money to the least well off, or the people furthest behind, as the SDG term is. That's encouraging, but I think we can do more. But it's good to see that the programme's working. On multinationals, just to correct you on this, we're not opposing a legally binding treaty at all. So Ireland is open to looking at options for progress on a legally binding treaty to regulate the activities of transnational corporations and other business enterprises, provided it covers all economic operators, whether multinationals or domestic companies. Any such instruments should reflect essential human rights principles. It should reaffirm the universality, indivisibility and interdependence of human rights and stress the primary responsibility of states under existing international human rights law to protect against human rights violations. We'd like to see any new initiative built on rather than duplicate existing measures such as the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the ILO tripartite declaration of principles concerning multinational enterprises and social policy. So it is something that, ultimately, if it is to achieve its objectives, any legally binding instrument must enjoy broad support among UN member states. This isn't going to work if a handful of countries do it, unless they're putting pressure on others to do the same. There needs to be a large coalition of countries that do this together if it's going to be effective. Otherwise, you will see certain business activity move away from countries that are trying to do the right thing and into others. So we want to try and reward countries for doing the right thing here and get a consensus-based approach, but certainly Ireland has no issue in terms of trying to work towards a legally binding instrument that would be effective. In terms of the European Peace Facility, the European Peace Facility is still a proposal at this stage, having been presented by High Representative Mogherini last year. It's receiving a technical examination at official level in Brussels, including within the context of the ongoing MFF process. The EPF proposes to bring together existing financial instruments, Athena, for the funding of CSDP operations and the African Peace Facility, supporting the African Union in peacekeeping. It proposes to increase the funding for these instruments. It also proposes to broaden the EU's capacity to provide military assistance in order to prevent conflict, preserve peace and strengthen international security in accordance with the objectives of the UN external action set out in Article 21.2 of the Treaty of the European Union. I mean, in simple terms, many parts of the world are a nasty place and governance is not working. Warlords dominate and make decisions. And the EU does sometimes have to intervene to try to support state actors who are trying to do the right thing, to support them. Somalia is a good example of that in terms of a government that is trying to change Somalia, to move away from violence and intimidation and terrorism. And there is a peacekeeping force there that, while over time reform is needed, is essential to actually maintain peace and stability. And the EU is a big part of funding that. Likewise, in terms of Athena, which was essentially an anti-piracy initiative on the shores of Somalia, actually, as it happens initially, where EU interventions and funding have made a hugely positive impact on reducing and undermining the capacity for piracy that has allowed shipping to happen in a much safer zone than was previously the case. So, I get what you're saying in relation to the focus of the EU needs to be on peace, stability, supporting that peace, responsible development and partnership and so on. But there are also times when we have to help with security infrastructure of a state. If we get that wrong, it can contribute to the problem.
Yes.
I accept that, right? I accept that. But, there is a reason why we have peacekeepers in different parts of the world. And that's essentially the UN version of this. And I would say that Irish peacekeepers that are trained soldiers on the Golan Heights, in southern Lebanon, in Mali, are making a positive contribution to peace. But they carry arms. And I also think that the EU has to have the capacity to be able to fund interventions and partnerships and programs that are about the more difficult side of conflict prevention and sometimes conflict intervention to try to bring about stability and peace. That this is a difficult area, I accept that, and there should be scrutiny in terms of how and where we spend money to make sure we are contributing to peace and not conflict. But I do think, having been to many of these regions, as I know you have, the intervention is sometimes the only course of action to protect vulnerable and exposed people to conflict. And that costs money and requires coordination and training and cooperation. And the EU is trying to create a more efficient and more effective collective response to that. That's my understanding around the European Peace Facility, which we're trying to achieve. In relation to Israel, and I know you're interested in this. I mean, first of all, I think we're doing a disservice to Palestinians to give up on a two-state solution, quite frankly. I don't believe that a two-state solution is no longer viable. I think a two-state solution is still viable, but the international community has to insist on that as being the outcome of any future peace negotiation. If we give up on that, well, then we are essentially talking about some kind of one-state solution where Palestinians continue to be controlled in an occupied territory. And I don't believe we'll ever have peace and stability